So welcome everyone who has joined by now to the webinar on how to pitch Kubernetes to your management. My name is Van Schubert. I take care of customers here at Giant Swarm, work with them on a strategic alignment, making sure that basically Kubernetes and cloud native develops within the customers as it's very beneficial for the company, and make sure that basically everything is on the right track to fulfill the goals that the company has set by entering and going on the journey with Kubernetes. I actually have, now there's the slide. We've got different starting points, and I think that's where the poll shows up, that we actually are spread across all different stages. Typically, we actually talk to companies and come to, let's say, decisive moments where either Kubernetes is just starting and they actually want to implement it for a single project, or it's about there are different projects within the organization that use Kubernetes and really they want to scale it, want to establish a central platform up to the point where they've been running either Kubernetes or a similar platform for, let's say, many years, and then there's a decision or a discussion coming up either from a cost perspective or an upgrade perspective or availability perspective, so reliability is questioned, or even further expansion, where a discussion comes up whether this is the right approach and if there's an opportunity to change and improve. What we actually have seen is that the pitch would be very different naturally on every stage, because if you actually want to pitch on a cloud migration level, then it's very likely to be to a project manager more than, let's say, the senior executive of a large organization, unless the project naturally is quite large and important, then it's a different approach. If you look at cloud scaling, where you want to establish a central platform across a large organization, very likely senior stakeholders will be part of that discussion, where you might end up having to pitch to your head of infrastructure, and then you probably need to equip that head of infrastructure with the right arguments so they can then go and pitch it to the senior executive, especially if you actually want to make this successful very quickly. You actually will need some budget, and that's something where you need to be very compelling. For the cloud optimization section, that actually is where it becomes really, really specific, because the pains are very, so everyone actually knows about Kubernetes to some extent, but the pains become apparent that you actually have is either development teams can't onboard as quickly as they want, or if things are not developing as they're planned, or it's not as reliable as expected. And that's where, or even a situation that we actually encountered this week is where the last member of a team that built up Kubernetes actually is leaving the company, and no one knows how to manage it. So that's where there are situations that are very specific to a certain use case, and naturally the value proposition is then very unique. So the pitch will definitely, there's no standard pitch. I think that's the message of the slide, and it needs to be adapted. But I think what we'll actually do throughout this session is take you through the value proposition that you actually will have at different stages, and especially the plan, which is something that is very important to really convince your stakeholders. Another piece of advice, and I'm pretty sure that's, you've got very similar experiences from pitching to your management. I actually made throughout my career pitching to senior executives, mid executives in large organizations, is that they actually really, come and cut to the point, make sure that you actually are really brief in your proposition. Make sure that you have explanations ready, but don't make it an educational experience like I'm doing right now. It's really there to set the stage for making a decision. And I think that's just very important to have in mind when you actually go through your plan and prepare your pitch, that you actually are very, very concise in what do you want? So you actually really need to break it down into achievable steps that you can discuss, so people can really go into that discussion, which is very likely a major part of your discussion or of the meeting. So if you actually look at your meeting and you allocate a third of that time to your presentation, that's pretty a good number. The idea is really to feel comfortable for the senior executive to make a decision on budget or next steps. And this is something that you basically need to build up that confidence, and it actually happens if you answer questions and go into discussions and make sure that they fully understand what your priorities are and what your recommendation is. So yes, you can show options and you can bring out options, different decisions, but you should have a clear recommendation in your head where you're going. Again, everyone is different, so your project manager might have different preferences than a infrastructure head, than a senior executive. But again, this is basically being very clear in your message, very clear of what you want is essential part. So I would say we can actually go into now the story, how you can pitch different things and build up that story. One element that is very important, I think, is, and that's not true for like every stage in the organization or that the organization is in, is that they actually need to have a basic understanding of what Kubernetes is. In organizations where you basically have large deployments of Kubernetes, I guess you probably don't, you can skip this stage. What I typically do is I just take them through a basic storytelling of what modern application development is. Yes, I won't talk about Kubernetes. I won't talk about how old development happened and how it changed and all these elements. Typically, what I do is I talk about that you actually have a new way of developing application that allows teams to work on parts of the application components very independently, that allows them to really make sure that they can bring out innovation a lot faster. And by doing so, take ownership of that, abstracting elements of that application into the underlying platform allows them to do that very efficiently. And I think if you actually build up that story very, very well, you will actually cover all aspects that you typically see in your value proposition for the cloud native development. So the primary goal is naturally to make sure that the development teams can be highly, highly efficient. So abstracting away the complexity that you typically see in the organization in software development and application development is a core part of the value proposition. And that's something we actually see across many customers, that they actually basically stand there and try to build a lot around software development to make sure that the teams can deploy very efficiently. They can go through testing cycles. They can make sure that they don't have to worry about certain elements that are repetitive, like they don't have to take care of observability or monitoring for their applications. You can help them establish a service mesh. This is where basically the development efficiency comes in. And that actually helps teams really bring out innovation very, very rapidly, which naturally also supports the goal of faster time to market. And one of the companies that I think really did an amazing job with faster time to market with the cloud native approach is Adidas. That they actually started off of their cloud native journey in, I think, 2012, when they basically had about an online revenue of 40 million. Last year, they actually hit the 4 billion number and basically increased the volume of and the revenue through online channels by 100 times. And that's actually due because they actually really thought about this agile transformation very intensively about their building their online shop on a cloud native basis, making sure they actually have this high deployment rate, have a lot of innovation in there, and actually also use the scalability of the cloud for building new revenue streams. So a large part of or a growing part of their online business comes from hype sales events. Hype sales events where they actually have limited numbers of let's say special shoes or other fashion wear, and they actually really this limitation creates a kind of a hype that where people actually then wait and try to get one of these limited numbers of goods, and it increases the traffic on the site by a factor of about 10, 20, sometimes 30,000 within seconds. And that's something that basically wouldn't be possible without the scalability of a cloud, without applications being able to being created repetitively to really handle the load and do the cover the user experience, to deliver these the shopping experience, and yeah, and the experience they actually have made is like during the last Black Friday event, the only systems that really stayed up and running were the systems on Kubernetes. And although this actually had degradation or downtimes over certain periods of time during that event. So this is something that, basically where they actually have really transformed their organization and being able, and it's a great example that you actually can use in your pitch to actually show what value lies in this environment. And yes, there are companies and industries where it applies more to than others, but it is something where when they actually started off with their journey, they actually didn't even know that like hype sales event would be something that would contribute to their revenue, something that developed over time. But just being able to adapt to that really rapidly, having the development teams being able to focus on innovation and using the scalability is something that yeah, basically played into their hands. The higher availability is also something that companies are looking forward to. Sometimes, naturally, like monolithic applications that you don't touch often are very, very stable. But in an environment that's changing rapidly, it's very likely that if you've got a replica sets, that it's a lot easier to ensure availability, make sure that you can faster reconcile to the state that you desire, and make sure that basically you stay up all the time, no matter what parts of the stack you upgrade, if it is the infrastructure or the application itself. So yeah, try to put these, like the value propositions. I typically always end up with these value propositions. You might have others, but I typically end up with these value propositions, and I tie them into a story on why Kubernetes actually will help achieve these and be a lot easier to achieve the goals than if you actually do things by hand or yeah, using old technology that basically can't really fulfill and can't play out their advantage in these fields. Yeah, thank you very much, David. Operational excellence, that's another good point here. Yeah, definitely. It's something that actually comes with it or it requires, because you actually really develop a lot of automation around it. And yeah, and that actually makes sure that you can actually do the upgrades very easily. That's true, and achieve the maintainability. Thank you very much. So let's think about the plan and how to come up with a plan that basically is part of. So once you actually have pitched your value or the value to the organization, which naturally is important, you actually really need to come up with your proposals. So what is your steps forward? And this is something that will be highly discussed So what I typically do is to come up with the 4 R's to get my mind straight on how you want to prioritize and how you want to lead that discussion in terms of making choices really quickly. So if your question is like, can we do it this way or can we do it another way? That's how I basically prove my plan in advance, but also use these elements to get a certain concept straight in my head so I can really respond to questions very, very rapidly. And these are, not new, but it's just something that, I think, especially in cloud native success, if you think about cloud native journey and the success of cloud native, it's something that, you basically can see over and over again. One element is the reuse. Kubernetes is at the heart of one of the largest open source projects. I think there are more than 100 Kubernetes distributions out there in the market. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get to another screen. And there is someone has done the job already. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. And I think that's where it actually comes down to really try to put together what has been developed, try to use open source because the community development will always be really, really fast and will probably always win versus a proprietary development. But what actually is true for sure is you actually won't be faster by reinventing the wheel. So use whatever you have or what is available. But another aspect that actually goes naturally hand in hand with that is be prepared to replace. So you actually will see that there are components, and you need to build your stack up with components that actually will either reach an end of life or will be outperformed by other components or might not be necessary anymore. And being able to flexibly adapt to these changes is something that is really important. We felt it ourselves. So we actually have developed, like we've been in the community space for over 6 years now, and basically the stuff we have developed over the time either got replaced. Let's say CoreOS is a library we used at the beginning. Then it actually was acquired by Red Hat and announced end of life. We replaced it with Flatcar. So there are like certain elements where the market changes, but there are also things where we actually had difficulties at the very beginning with, let's say, certain offerings and had to develop something ourselves. But in the meantime, let's say if you look at observability, it's like, you actually have the proprietary solutions, but you can also find open source components and they're getting better and better. So eventually you will end up being able to replace certain elements with components. And I think that's something you just need to keep in mind. Your investment in the technology is not for nothing. It's something where you learn, but you need to be fine. You need to be prepared to give up and replace components if you actually see better value from them. Another element that I talk about is really reduce. It's something that actually is more applicable for organizations that have a large infrastructure background and that actually really have difficulty to understand their role in this new environment. So if you actually look at large infrastructure providers, they actually, or teams, they actually have been working on servers and Linux operating systems and so on and so forth. And this is something that actually is already provided and covered in a lot of automation going forward. But that doesn't mean that the team doesn't have something to do. The point is that in cloud native, the complexity that used to be in the applications actually gets abstracted into the infrastructure layer. And someone has to take care of that. And it's not necessarily Kubernetes. It may be all the network traffic in between. It may be the applications that come on top of it. It may be how you actually focus on delivering a better user experience for your developers. So there are elements in there where you can basically think about how you can expand on them to really empower the development teams to accelerate. And I think this is something that is just to keep in mind. Really focus on things that give you a competitive edge, and not on things that you can easily get from somewhere else. And focus on how you can drive this competitive edge, especially by freeing up time from your software developers and making that more efficient. And the final element is naturally the resale. Nothing will be adopted by itself. You will need to go out and really tell everyone about what you have there. You need to start engaging. And this is something that you actually will need support from, especially from your management and other areas of the organization, to really establish a common platform. And we use lots of the components that you're developing. So, this is something where just providing it, if the plan doesn't cover the aspect of reselling it and reselling also the methodology of cloud native, so teams can better make use out of it, then you're actually falling short. And this is just something to keep in mind when you actually build up your arguments throughout the plan. Hope that makes sense. So if you actually talk about your cloud native strategy and how you want to support it, there are naturally 3 elements that you need to cover. Interestingly enough, many focus just on technology. So if you actually are just thinking about how to build the platform and how to maintain it, using getting updates and really basically getting support if you need it, then this is just one pillar. Actually, I've run into situations where customers or companies have built up their cloud native stack over 2 years, and we're about a couple of weeks before go live, and then they actually, it dawned to them that they actually don't know how to do and how to cover operations 24/7. So that's where technology is important, and you need to figure out what components do you need to start off with. What kind of level do you want to achieve? But you also need to think about operations. How do you cover it 24/7? How do you fix things? What SLAs do you want to provide? How do you want to upgrade it? How can you train upgrades with the teams? So there's a whole concept around operations that actually makes your life a lot easier. And it also has to do with naturally technology, because the more technology you take in, the more difficult it becomes for you to operate. Especially if the size of your team is very limited. And then the third aspect naturally is evolution. So how actually does it evolve over time, and how can you actually drive this evolution forward? So how can you establish the Kubernetes environment as maybe a standard platform if you're in the second channel? How can you evolve it to make sure that you can accommodate different new requests from different development teams? Should you be the driver, or are you the person responding to requests from development teams? Think about your role and pitch, and make sure that your plan covers all 3 aspects, not only technology and operations, but also the evolution part. And that actually comes down to a little bit of milestones that you can achieve, and I'll speak about milestones in just a minute. But here's an example of basically the evolution of your cloud native platform. Proposedly, that's one element where you can start off with naturally the Kubernetes and core components. That's maybe what some of you already did, is install Kubernetes, install some components, basically figure out how they work, how Helm charts work, how you install applications, how do you make sure how things work in a single cluster. Then you actually will think about how you do multi-cluster. You might be scripting with Terraform or whatever. So there are many elements to that where you actually will grow, and you need to define a scope for for what it's takes as a basis to deploy clusters and make sure that you can then build, test, and deploy your workloads into them or your containers into them. And that's, where basically a basic CI/CD naturally is part of the initial testing to make sure that you can really test and see if everything works. And in most projects, you actually will have some kind of a database that is either resides within or outside of Kubernetes. You actually will need some kind of monitoring. So these three components actually go very, very closely. Yes, you can actually separate them out because not, there are different. There might be different milestones associated to them. You might already have a deployment pipeline for your containers, and you just need to point it to the right endpoint, and then it actually deploys up to Kubernetes. But yeah, these are things you probably, or you will likely make some changes. But then eventually, you actually will have more and more requests, and there's more and more opportunity to really help. What about the apps that you actually need to have on top of that? So, for example, do you actually want to have certain testing? Do you want to have scalability covered very, very differently? Do you want to have let's say Kafka or message queues or a service mesh for delivering certain functionality? That's where basically your teams will have questions and ask you, and you need to decide whether you can support them now, what the timeline is, and if that's sufficient for the team. Because what you actually don't want is that you develop stuff, and then by the time it's done, they actually don't need it anymore, or they actually have covered it differently. And there are many, many other areas where you can actually basically invest a lot of time. One is security. Naturally, you actually will need a security approval if you actually do everything on-prem, or if your public cloud then connects back to your backend system on-prem. That's where basically security clearance naturally is important. But there are like many layers that you can think about to establish security, up to using Vault for secrets and many of these things that actually can expand into lots of complex setups. Governance might be another aspect. Who can do what? Automation actually for multi-cluster setups. Auto scaling, if you've got needs, as I described from Adidas, then auto scaling doesn't work. So you actually need to come up with special solutions. Cost allocation is another element that we actually often run into. So when you've got different teams using the structures, how do you allocate the cost and then basically optimize that? Then there are actually also elements that you need to cover, which is how do you want to operate it, or how do you want to consume? How much do you want to do internally, and how much do you want to do externally? So yes, naturally, everything is open source, so you can actually go out there, you can build everything yourself. Or you can use a distribution that is already available, or something as a service where you basically then have a company take care of certain elements. And that sometimes that actually works great. Other times, let's say in on-prem environments, that might be a bit more challenging, or you actually can really, really outsource Kubernetes operations, have an SRE team that basically take care of also managing the applications on top, and can basically support your internal team. And this is just only for the Kubernetes stack. There are like tons of things that you can do on the outside, like CI/CD, which might not even be included here. So there are elements how you can think about going from one place to another. So let's say if this is the path from A to B, you actually can use a bicycle, or you can go by foot, which probably is quite cheap, but it actually takes time. and that's something that you basically need to get the priorities clear to then decide which model works best for you. So if you actually need to go live with a project in 3 to 4 months, you might want someone who actually basically covers everything to make sure that it actually goes live and that you've got a full team of people that can do and cover operations 24/7. That's at least what we've seen quite many times, is like really the pressure. Other use cases where we actually also see a trend to outsourcing is like if it actually is not this core capabilities and the core differentiation, we actually see that more and more now, where people really think about building up smaller teams, especially if it's a new innovative area of an organization. They actually tend to set up smaller teams that make sure that they actually basically capture the concepts and the requirements from the development team, and then try to implement that together with the partner, and make sure that it's available very, very quickly. Because externally you can scale, internally it's difficult to scale. There are organizations that actually have invested quite immensely to start off with. So Zalando, I think they had about 40 people to start off with. Schwarz Group, I think, as well. So these are like, if you've got these resources, then naturally you can basically do it yourself. But still, then a question is like, is everyone trained in the area? Do they actually have the automation, the experience? So that's where you need to make a choice between cost, between speed, between the, let's say, usability or deployment across the organization, to make sure that you basically decide on one operations model that makes sense for you and for your company, and really focus on that one and build arguments for them. And especially get prepared according to what I described before. And it's like, if you the 4 R's, really think through what different operation models make sense for your company, and challenge them. Also in terms of replacement, in terms of reduction, focus on key functionality that helps your developers become more efficient, instead of trying to support, let's say, or build your own operating system. So that's basically that's a choice that you need to make. But at least these are the options that you typically see and are available. So, and then typically when you're actually gone through the plan, and I fully agree with Jen David, it's a question I'll pick up at the end, that yes, you actually need to talk about costs and hardware, software costs. It's not only the technology license cost, but also the hardware and also the resources that you actually need to build up the experience, and maybe even consider opportunity costs. So how much benefit can you achieve by going fast on the cloud native journey versus slower? But I pick it up at the end. So let's continue a little bit with the discussion. I'm trying and targeting to be done at about 45, so we've got some time to actually answer questions and go into that discussion. So one element is naturally, once you actually went through the plan, and that's where you probably will have a lot of discussions, where you hopefully will have made up your mind what you actually really want from your management, and what the goals are, that you should definitely have, like, basically your backup plan or in the backup, a plan that basically defines milestones that you want to be measured on, that might unlock different levels of financial support that you're hoping for. So naturally, if you don't have a Kubernetes platform, this is something that you need to establish first. If you want to replace the one that you currently have, that's also something you need to think about. It can be in the private and public cloud, and you need to think about how to establish and what the limitations are for each option. Establish means like installing it, making sure that it actually is you can operate it. But then the most important thing, at least from my perspective, is that you actually really develop with applications, so with use cases and with usage. So you might start off with, let's say, a new project that actually wants to deploy their microservices, and you define a blueprint for that, or you actually have a migration. So we actually have several customers that want to move their Spring Boot monoliths into the environment, and then build from there and break them up. And they actually will have broken them up rather realistically beforehand, but it actually won't be as granular as a new application that you actually develop. So think about what libraries do you need, what you need to establish so it can actually be deployed quite successfully, and then really go out and find other applications that are there that are very similar, and get them on board to make sure that you basically can make use of the platform and achieve these quick wins. We actually managed to do something with Deutsche Telekom that actually went along that line, where we basically, it took some time to establish a platform with all the on-prem limitations that were set up and the requirements. But once we actually had the first application in the platform, we actually had a blueprint, and now the organization, they can actually move one application over after the other, which is very, very smooth. And actually, I think it only took 3 weeks for the first 10 applications, which is just like a proof point that yes, you can move things over, yes, everything works, it's in operations, and then you can basically establish a routine for this around it, which you definitely need with the teams to educate them on what are the prerequisites, how do you develop cloud native. We actually see challenges later on in the journey, especially if the teams move onto the platform prematurely, that their understanding is that the system will run forever without upgrades, which is something that it actually takes some time to really take them on the journey, make and help them understand that they actually will need to prepare for replacement. That's the whole concept, and then probably establish also a way to enforce upgrades, for example, with upgrade windows where you deliberately roll nodes every time, just to make sure that the application can survive. And that actually brings also priority to the development teams to focus on elements that will help them develop more and get more out of the cloud native principles. And then also, that's like kind of the fire drills. Make sure that, if there's something that happens, that everything works. Once you actually have established that for your platform, then, you actually can focus on different other technologies and services that, may be required. If it's Kafka, or if it's, as a service mesh or whatever, then these are things that, basically you already build on a well-established platform. Just give me a second and just excuse me. And then you naturally need to think about how do you want to constantly refine the setup. So these might be different milestones that you want to be measured upon, and they might unlock different budgets that then will be made available. I think the most important thing is really to also embrace something from the very beginning, which is that it's not about building up something and then just running it. It's about constantly refining the setup and improving it. And as I said, it's like, it can go a long way with, basically up to cost optimization, regular review cycles where you actually will want to have management attention on the project just to make sure that you basically have the budget to expand and deploy the create adoption across the organization a lot more easily. And then we actually basically can think of obstacles, which is also a very important part in the discussion. So what do you foresee going wrong? Or what can be challenging, and where do you need support to make this successful? Because yes, there is a need for a goal, that you actually can spare the time to take care of it. There is a need for budget. And there naturally needs to be an agreed milestone according to this plan. But there typically will also be discussions about, what else do you need to make sure that this happens and this is actually successful. And there are like certain elements that, I think you can come up with a whole list all by yourself. Here's like a little list of inspirations. One is if you actually have a more traditional infrastructure team, this is something where you actually would need to think about how you can establish change management within the organization, because yes, all people that you actually have are typically will still be needed. So it's not about reducing the headcount, it's about reducing the scope, because you'll be inheriting a lot of complexity that actually used to be in the applications. And this is something that you actually need to focus on. And I think the most important thing, at least what we've seen, is really think about how you can take your infrastructure team, especially if it's a well-established traditional infrastructure team, how you can actually make that transition happen and successful. Because, if you actually look at what you're doing right now, there are elements that will go away, and there are other elements that actually will come. You will have to script a lot, or you will actually do more programming than you actually will do configuration. So there are elements that, where the role of the infrastructure team actually will change. And at least the way I foresee it is the infrastructure team is the one that can drive that change. It can drive the efficiency across the organization and make use of a better use of the time of the software developers. So this is a very important role, but it's a very unusual role that, or at least something that most infrastructure teams might not have experienced themselves, and that's why working together with an organization that actually can do change management in that respect, show what responsibilities there are, how they actually should be operating, is something that is well perceived and actually has worked very wonderfully in the past. And you can actually, there are organizations out there like Container Solutions or VRD or other that actually do that constantly. So this is something that you should definitely consider. Existing deployment of Kubernetes. This can be a problem, cannot be a problem, depends on how strong these different project teams are. If you're establishing a new platform, you will be challenged with requirements that basically their platform already fulfills. It may be not necessarily your first area of focus, because it's very difficult to convince someone, and it'll take a lot more effort to convince someone who actually has built up something themselves, versus someone who actually, something that they can readily use. And to make them switch, although it hasn't proven yet, is just being established, is always very, very challenging. So this is something that you need to think about. If there are existing Kubernetes deployments, should they just continue doing their own stuff and you actually build up something that actually makes sense for the organization, for the whole organization, instead, and then hope that they actually will migrate over at some stage, or is it is something that it's the biggest, best use case you can get in the organization, and it probably will be like this for the next years? Then it's something that we actually probably will have less option. So that's where you basically need to foresee how you want to deal with existing Kubernetes deployments. Special requirements from team. That's something that can bog you down very, very quickly, especially prevent the adoption of the platform. This is where you really need to understand how you want to operate as a product. Make sure that you actually don't support all kinds of requests just because someone has them, but really understand why they actually need them and how you can best solve that problem for everyone. That's a bit of like it's something that service companies and consulting companies are not very good at. That's more a trait of a product company. So that's where you basically need to think about these two traits of organizations, and which, if it's a problem within your organization or not. If you're actually always very much product oriented, then you probably will have the skills to defend requirements that will actually more hold you up than bring you forward. And naturally, requirements for customer natural start is it actually, Kubernetes cloud native journey is always an investment game at the very beginning. At some stage, at least that's what we've seen in organizations, you will have to think about how to refinance the cost, and that actually happens, let's say, after about 2-3 years. So probably nowadays a lot faster than say 2-3 years ago. But if you actually have to be cost neutral from the very start, then that's something where you need to be very clear that's impossible. And that's where you actually need to think about how you can actually basically convince your stakeholder to invest in this, and provide a path of investment and adoption that actually is based on the value that you can provide. Typically, yes, you can probably argue from a cost perspective, and I think that's what Jan David, you actually meant. You actually basically have a lot of overhead cost for hardware and software that you need to operate, which you can then better consume in the cloud. But that really depends. It depends on how much overhead and how efficient the applications can use these elements, or the hardware and the software that you provision. If you actually have spikes, definitely that's a lot cheaper in the cloud. If you've got a very predictable operations in terms of the load that you're getting, it's very possible that, and if you've got more monolithic applications currently, it's very likely that the consumption will actually increase in the cloud versus on-prem. But yeah, it's definitely something that you want to consider. As a cost optimization, it's possible, but it really depends on the situation you're in. So